I came here in '55, I guess it was, and stayed and left June 1, '64. I graduated from Washington State and helped a fellow put a radio station on the air in Lewiston, Idaho, and worked there for a little while. And then a chum of mine who I'd gone to school with, Dick Gardner, who was doing a children's show over here, puppeteer and that sort of stuff, and called me one day and said they need a sports guy. John Jarstead was thinking about retiring or going off to do something else, and if you have any interest, call Dave Crockett. Well, you know, I thought Dave Crockett went away before the Alamo, but lo and behold, he was the program director at KOMO at the time. And so I came over and we had a visit, and a nice visit. And the following Wednesday, he called and said, "You got the job if you want it." 10 years.
10 years. So when you moved to Seattle, what was the sports scene like here? What were the major sports in town?
Well, the big sport were the Rainiers, the old Pacific Coast League. The University of Washington was in trouble post-McElhaney days because they discovered the slush fund, which eventuated into Jim Owens coming here after Darrell Royal had been here for a year. Seattle University basketball was a big story normally. And when Bilko came to town, Steve got a crowd. Freddie Hutch was here for a year when Rainiers won the championship of the Pacific Coast League, but there was no major league sports here. Seattle was geographically isolated, if you will, because of the mountains for road traffic and because there just weren't that many people here at the time. But then they had a little thing they called an expo that turned into a World's Fair that saved Seattle, because there were some people, including the former governor and a couple of council members, who wanted to move the city to the Kent Valley. And they were not successful, obviously, big fight about it. But that little World's Fair drew huge crowds, got a lot of publicity, and all of a sudden the world discovered the Pacific Northwest, and the rest is in front of you. It's one of the prettiest cities in the country.
Well, when you were in Lewiston, Idaho, had you heard of hydros? Did you know what they were?
Oh, of course. Everybody up here knew what hydros were. I'd never been around them. I didn't know anything about them, you know. I just knew that there were big boats with airplane engines that ran fast. But I got over here and became friends with Mike Welch and a lot of the guys here. And in fact, Mike worked with me, and we became very close friends. Over the years, I just went to the garage and learned how. I'd go down to watch those people, and I knew something about airplane engines because I had been a crew chief in the Marine Corps in China. And so I knew how an engine worked, reciprocating engine in particular. The turbos, I don't know anything about them, but they were not in the party in those days. The halcyon days of the sport may have been triggered by this 1955 fiasco we had with these silly rules. You got all these heats and heats and heats, but then you add up the heats into a sum, and whoever ran the fastest overall time for the distance was the winner. And that's when Lee Shaneth beat Muncey and won the Gold Cup because he was a few seconds faster overall. Though when Bill brought in the Thriftway after the '55 race, he and everybody else thought he had won it. But the highlight, despite all of the controversy over who won the Gold Cup, the highlight of the day may very well have been that Tex Johnson brought the original prototype Boeing 707 over the lake and rolled it. And William E. Allen, the president of Boeing, was up on the top of the barge, same level we were, and I thought he was going to faint.
So how did the city react when Lee Shaneth won the Gold Cup instead of Bill Muncey?
Well, there was a lot of crepe around town. I mean, you could have used an extra day of organ music, there's no question about it. But it was very important to this city. It was very important to the psyche of the region, because there were a lot of people who lived here, including me by then, who had very strong feelings. We knew what a great piece of Americana we had here. And we were never sure, I don't think, that we wanted the rest of the world to know about it. but it eventually came to that. But the unlimited hydroplane was the bullet, I think, for the city of Seattle and the surrounding area that got the kind of attention it needed to become a burgeoning city in the country. I remember one time we did a live thing for the old Wide Wide World, Dave Garraway and Arlene Francis, when KOMO was still an NBC affiliate. But I worked here 10 years as news as well as sports. And you know, I've often said I've been in the business now 53 years. I've had 2 jobs and 1 wife, which proves I don't know a damn thing about show business, right? But having been here was a great opportunity for people of my generation. Because if you had the passion, and if you were willing, and you married the right woman who would put up with this nonsense, then you could work yourself to death learning your trade. And that's what we were able to do. We just worked till we dropped, but we learned our trade. We had a 5-man newsroom. Now they got 50.
Did you go from here straight to ABC?
Yep.
That's a big step.
Oh. I had to be talked into it.
Why?
Well, I was not enamored. First place, I wasn't going to live in New York. I was not enamored with the network. I was making a good living here by then, finally. Wasn't too good when you started, but we finally got enough money to live on and got along well, and 2 of our children were born here.
How did ABC find you?
We were doing things up here. We did the first live broadcast of a sports event from the Soviet Union to the United States in July of 1958, involving the University of Washington crew. And went over, dared to do it, and did. Little things like that add up to a sum eventually, and the word gets around. And I was doing some network stuff here, there, and everywhere. And then in '62, when the old American Football League came along, that also was another point of exposure. And it offered the kind of thing that I wanted to do, which was a lot of different things. That's why I enjoyed unlimited hydroplane racing. It was new to me. And there was a dynamic about the people involved in the sport. Most people didn't think about it, but if you look at it long enough, you realize every time that guy put on his hard hat and went out there on that water, he might not come back. They were crazy as hell. And they were willing to take chances, not for any reason other than that's the way God made them. They did it competing. They didn't do it to satisfy anybody but themselves and their group who were putting that boat in the water, and expected them to give them the best effort they could give. And I don't remember anybody who didn't do that, because you get swept along with the tide, you know. It consumes you.
There were hero drivers, and if I say the name Slovak, what comes to mind?
Well, I know all about him. He flew the plane out of Czechoslovakia and all that stuff, and escaped and worked for Bill Boeing, and it was junior and crop dusting and things like that. And Bill was the one who got him started in the boat racing. I also remember at the Diamond Cup in Coeur d'Alene when he was dead. He had a terrible wreck. The Bardol went into a swell, and they worked hard on him to save him, but he came back. He was in good shape and made out of hamstrings and old leather anyway, you know. But they brought him back, and he was fine in 2 days. But I mean, it was close. And of course, you had the dramatic Russ Slay, and you had that indefatigable little bugger Bill Stead and Norm Evans and those kind of people. They were one of a kind. They were a special breed. Jack Regis, on and on it goes. But the biggest ego, and without question, the hardiest competitor, had to be Bill Muncey. Muncey walked in a room, he made damn sure you knew he was there. I mean, that was part of that. You can't be that kind of a warrior without having an ego. But then you also have to be able to do what you say, and then people will buy it. Well, nobody ever could fault Muncey for not trying. And I never will forget that time that, boom, they had that collision out there, you know, and he wound up floating in the water, and everybody, oh my word. But again, they pulled him out, pumped him out, and he went on his way and was racing again within the month. So it is all sports, all competitive events have their own kind of people. And the guys who race unlimited hydroplanes, especially in that generation, I thought were one of a kind. Once you got into your jets and your turbos and the big money that Budweiser brought and all this stuff, and it changed the sport. But when, back in the 50s, when the slow motions were running, and when Lou Fagel took the upside down ride on Lake Washington in qualifying, and the traffic across the country to Detroit, and the traffic to Coeur d'Alene, to that race over there, and Lake Chelan. There was some pretty good stuff that took place on Lake Chelan over the years. But it was a flavor that belonged to us. I know that Detroit been racing boats forever and a day up and down the Detroit River, but it's not the same. It's different out here.
Now, Muncey was a big name in the sport, but was he a big name in the community as well?
Well, he was, I think he was a very important cog in the Thriftway marketing program. I think that was part of his deal with him, that he had to do a certain amount of that. And he was good at it. I mean, he was good. Hey, he went down to San Diego and stirred that pot down there, and the first thing you know, you had a race down there. No, Bill was very effective at what he did, and had a passion for it.
Did he function as a spokesperson for the sport in any way?
Well, I think he did, yeah. Even unwittingly, I think he did. But he knew what he was selling. First off, he's selling the sport, and then he's selling Bill Muncey and Thriftway. And why not? That's the way you got to do it. And there were some people that chipped at him a little bit here and there, but so what?
Now, he became a broadcast partner of yours a couple times doing color commentary on ABC,
Yeah.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
What was he like to work with?
He was lazy. Didn't do his homework. He thought he knew everything there was to know about it, and I reckon he did, but transferring that from here, through here, out there, so that little old lady in Rock Springs, Wyoming can understand it, that's different. But he was fine. He was good. He's as good as anybody that the only wiser guy, I guess, in that sport that I would want to put my time involved in it would be Mike Welch, because Mike was very much involved with Stanley Sayers and the slow motions, and was an engineer and a Boeing guy and all of that, and knew everything there was to know about it, I think. But these were, a lot of these guys, not your big winners, not your Bill Munceys and the Gale Electric guys, and even old Jack Schaefer of Such Crust Bakeries and so on, and Norm Evans and the Kaiser people, when they got into it, you know, they had money. But there were a lot of these guys that didn't have a lot of money, and they formed that second tier of competition that gave the sport its life. Because if you've only got 5 or 6 people out there shooting at each other and going lickety-split, it's boring after a while. But here you've got the second tier that they become the underdog, and the people take them to their heart and go, you know, want them to go sick them, knock off one of these big dudes, and every once in a while it would happen. And it was great. And when you go out there on a Gold Cup day or that Seafair thing and hear 500,000 people screaming and yelling because here's somebody from Tacoma coming out of nowhere and he knocks off one of those big guys. Boy, they loved it.
Now, we've heard the number 500,000 as a crowd before. Is it really that many people?
I don't have a clue. Jack Gordon used to be the fount of all information having to do with Seafair. Jack said, I have 500,000, that's good for me. Go. Who's going to go out there and count them? I don't have a clue how many people were there, but it was crowded.
I think you were with Bill in the Gold Cup in '66 when Chuck Thompson was killed. You were doing
In Detroit?
in Detroit. Yeah.
Yes, I believe that's correct. Yes.
How did that affect you? First off.
Well, I'm not touched by it, frankly. At the time, once the day's done, and you go home, then you have a different reaction to it. But when the event's going on, car racing, whatever, I'm not overwhelmed at the time, because at the time my job is my job, and I try not to let things interfere with it.
Did you see that it had an impact on Bill? And if it did, how did it affect him?
Oh, he'd seen it before. Chuck was a special guy. He had a great history in the sport. Everybody loved him. He was a good guy. But it's a risk. When you pull away from the dock, it's a risk. And if you're going to take it, eventually maybe you have to pay for it, right?
Do you think that string of fatalities that took place in '66, where there were 4 drivers killed in 2 races in 2 weeks, did that affect the sport?
Oh, no question. It took away statesmen. It took away some of the heart. It magnified the element of risk. It did in the backyard engineer. Now you had to have a lot of money. But it changed the sport. No question it changed it. Absolutely it changed it.
What was it about Muncey that set him apart?
He was tougher than hell. He was a ball-busting tough SOB. He gave no quarter and he took no quarter on the race course. He'd beat you. Put marbles in the ring, he'd try to beat you.
You continued to cover the hydros for years after you left Seattle. Probably for
Not many. I think I did 3 races after that for Wide World of Sports.
I know that you were there in '71 when McCormick won the Gold Cup there.
Madison.
Special memories about that day?
Yeah, I flew there in a left-handed airplane made in Japan. I remember that. And the guys had a hell of a time figuring out how to land it. But I'd been doing something somewhere else, and we chartered, I don't remember exactly, maybe a Mitsubishi, but it was a little guy that went like a Dickens. And the guys that were flying it had never really flown it that distance. And so they were training themselves on the way. That got my attention, but well, wasn't that really the beginning, though? That was about the time when Budweiser was on its way to becoming the dominant force. Well, here's a perfect example of the underdog, the guy, the backyard engineer, who's got courage and skill and almost everything but money going for him, but maybe just enough to once in a while reach in the pot and pull out that special trophy. And that was an instance of it, where the hometown guy won it and went strutting down Main Street with it, and good on him.
Good.
I don't know. I'm 77 years old. I don't remember as well as I used to.
Well, I got to back up, and you say that you were crew chief in the Air Force. What type of plane did you work?
No, I was a Marine Corps.
A Marine Corps.
I was a Marine. We flew what the Navy got tired of and threw away, and we'd patch them back together. And I was in China and funky places like that. Transports, R5Cs. I was a crew chief, believe it or not, on an F6F, an old Wildcat, and an F7F Tiger Cat, and the kind that had the glide factor of a rock, But I grew up. I joined the Marines very, very young. And I was one of those young Marines that I was too young to vote, couldn't buy a beer, but I could damn sure get shot. I still remember that. But I like my 4 years plus in the Marine Corps. I thought it exposed me to a lot of things, and got a chance to do a lot of things and went a lot of places and met some fine people. And I to this day carry part of it with me all the time because it just became part of my life. It was the quote formative years.
What years were you in?
46 to 50. Tedious times, but not exact warfare, but still dangerous.
Yeah. Let's hold on for
The Air Force to come.
It's Kenmore area.
I thought that was an old beaver. I could tell that sound. They were going to build beavers over in Calgary. Somebody put a lot of money, $10 million into the proposal to go build beavers again. They never got the doors open. They built one airplane. You know why?
There's so many of them left.
Because the old ones are still running.
Yeah, there you go. They
everywhere.
won't die.
Up at Chelan Airways, I mean, they're all over, and they're.
I use one all the time. In fact, I owned a part of one for a long time until
Do you pilot them?
illegally.
Cut the tape off. Don't say that.
We had
I got it.
the guy that I owned half of the plane, and but it's got cheaper to charter. They took away the tax advantages because you can go from Vancouver Airport to our house in 35 minutes in a Beaver, but it takes you 2.5 hours by car and ferry. So.
Ready to go?
Yeah. All yours.
So eventually, Bill Muncey is killed in Acapulco. Do you remember hearing about that, and what was your reaction when you heard
Yes, I did. I heard about it, and I was obviously sorry to hear it, because I admire a warrior, and he was. But if you're going to lose him, I'd rather lose him on a grand venue, here or Detroit. I mean, I felt that he deserved that, but it didn't work that way. I mean, he left us down there, and that's the way it is. But again, it was his willingness to take that risk to help sell that sport. That's what he did.
The sport is kind of falling on hard times right now. You mentioned earlier the Budweiser and the domination. What do you think's caused the sport to lose its appeal?
Oh, I think going to the jets and all this fancy space age stuff, and all of the romance left. Drag racing suffered a great loss when Don Garlits was taken out, because there was one of the great backyard engineers of that sport. And that sport rode his back for a long time. And I just think you need to retain, everything done in the past wasn't bad, okay? And you don't have to keep pace with everything in the world so that you're on the so-called cutting edge. Everybody understands a reciprocating engine. Now we may have to, well, go away. Whack, whack, whack yourself.
He doesn't understand the
I think
reciprocating
he's
engine.
disagreeing. I think he's disagreeing with you.
Everybody knows about a garage. Everybody knows about an uncle or a grandpa or somebody who used to use the garage for their tinkering and building and rebuilding engines. Everybody knows about the bootleggers that made an old flathead Ford go fast so the sheriff couldn't catch him. We all know about the rum runners and all of the romance of those times. I think to some degree, the reciprocating engine, the sound of the engine, the smell of the gasoline, all of that adds up into something that everybody could feel, could touch. I think the turbojet was something way out there that your average person could never really get close to and could probably not understand, except it went fast and it lasted longer, and it didn't blow the push rod through the side of the engine and things like that. But how many times have I seen people after a boat race right down here on Lake Washington, when the race is over, they go down into the pits and they want a piece of that engine. They'll go down and beg for a piece of this because it becomes a piece of memorabilia. They shine it up, they put it on the coffee table, and it becomes a conversation piece. There are thousands of instances where that happened, but I don't know that I've ever seen it happen when you had. It's equal or much like when Bill Stead and those guys, Myra and Rush Slay and all those guys who were pilots, helped bring back the air races. And the first air race was run at the outside of, on Indian land, outside the Stead Air Force Base in Nevada. And that was, the air base was named for Bill Stead's brother, who had been quite a hero in the Second World War. But they went out there with a bulldozer and made a landing area, and Slovak, we had P-51s, and Slovak showed up in a Bearcat that Ralph Hart of Uline had bankrolled for him. And he goes out, everybody else is up here going around and around the pylons, and Slovak's down there collecting chaparral in the engine. And I mean, they had to go in and pull all that stuff out of the nacelle once the race was over, but that's how he won. Stayed right down on the deck. So Slovak won, and instead, of course, and we lost Bill Stead in a Formula One race down in St. Pete, Florida. But again, it just proves that Muncey wasn't involved in the air races because he hadn't had time to learn how to do it. If he'd had the time and money to build him an airplane, he probably would have done that too. But those were the kind of guys that were doing it in those days, and they were fun.
Are they bigger than life?
Yes. Oh, yes. Absolutely. Especially here. I think more here than any place else. There was just that magic relationship between the people of the Seattle area and those guys who ran unlimited hydroplanes, because it belonged to us, they thought. And it was a terrible, crunching, bad feeling when somebody came in from Detroit and won the bloody Gold Cup. And it was not a good time.
Do you remember what it was like the first time you stood on the beach and saw 6 of these boats coming at you at 150 miles an hour from the start?
First time I ever saw it, I covered the race. So I looked at it through different eyes. Really, just to sit there and see it as a spectator, I never had that privilege. I was working. I remember too when King had 60-inch lens, and Howard Moses was a bit of an optics engineer and worked for KOMO. And Howard walked in one day and he said, "You know, I can build you a 90-inch lens if you want." And well, then the word got around and King went to 90 inches. And then we asked Howard, what about something bigger than that? And he said, 110, we'll make 110 inches, but you're gonna have trouble positioning it in some place where you have stability, so it's usable. Well, you know where he built the 110-inch lens, which made King folks cranky, and we anchored it on the base of the Lake Washington floating bridge. And that's where that shot of that hydroplane coming right at you, the whole back straight, that's where that came from.
Wow.
But the only way you could use a lens that big was to fasten it onto that concrete base. But those were fun days. I'll tell you something. It's been around more than a half century in this funky business and watching the evolution of it. There was no place in this country where there was more competition between two television stations than here, between King and Como in the 50s and 60s. I mean, it was fierce.
And that competition, did it manifest itself in the way they covered the races?
Absolutely. You're going to think you're going to go out there and build a 110-inch lens for one event? That thing was never used again. Maybe to take a picture of the moon for Halloween or something, but it was useless except for what we used it for and what it was built for. But it came out of a fertile mind, you know. That's hydroplane racing, making airplane engines, taking an engine taking old Merlin out of a Messerschmitt, bring it over here and rebuild it and put it into a hydroplane. I mean, that's spiffy.
Kind of like gunslinging days in a way?
Oh, sure. Boys have been known to bend a knuckle here and there.
He would lose.
Well,
Run out by
there's no question, but Muncey hated to lose. And in the perspective of some, I think that they may have felt he was a bit of a whiner. He didn't have any problem about going to bend in the ear of the commission or a referee or or getting a little copy going, and he was always looking for an edge. He was a competitor, and that's what people do who are in that kind of business. They constantly seek an edge. Golf club makers, I mean, you name it, they do it.
Anything else? Mark, do you have any question?
Anything you need for the footage?
I'm curious, you talk about these people as being a different breed, and I think you see them astutely. Were you ever a personal friend with any of them?
Yeah, not really close though.
'Cause
I always had a problem becoming too good a friend with the athletes that I've covered in my lifetime, the politicians that I covered as a news correspondent, the coaches, the players. Eventually you're going to be put in a position where you're going to have to say something that they're not going to like and their legions won't like, but you feel is true and should be said. So if you have not put yourself in a position where you have to compromise a friendship to tell something, as they are wont to say, as you see it, then you have to watch yourself. You have to be careful.
Are there any stories that you have that we haven't asked about? Anything that when you know, a favorite memory of the 50s, of Seattle, of boat racing?
Well, I did something in those days, I guess, unwittingly, that I do now intentionally, 50 years later. I go early and try to sit quietly and look and listen. Because if your mouth's open, it's hard to hear. But it's there where those moments when the crews are coming to do their work, or when you go to the garage at 2 o'clock in the morning and you see these same men who are going to go out there and clean shirts the next morning and try to say to the world, look at us, we're fresh as a daisy, when they've worked all night. I mean, those kind of things are wonderful to see, because the people who were doing the racing in those days in the unlimited hydroplane were not making a lot of money. Muncey made pretty good money with the thrift trade, Willard Rhodes and everybody. But a lot of guys just nickel and dimed, you know. They had to go to grandma's house and rob the cookie jar to buy the fuel for the race, or a motel room where 6 guys would sleep. But I just like those kind of folks. I mean, they're knuckle busters, they're willing, they're honest, they're protective, and some of them are whiners, but then sometimes they have good reason to bitch a little bit. We all do.
If you had to describe, I'm going to ask you 2 things. If you had to describe the sport to someone who'd never seen it, the sport as you knew it in the 50s, how would you describe it?
Take a comfortable chair, a bucket of cold water, and a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and plan on spending the day. You need a pair of glasses, you need a pair of binoculars, and the higher ground doesn't hurt.
And if someone who'd never met Bill Muncey, how would you describe him?
Well, he comes in like a blast of air off the desert, and by the time you get through spending an hour or 2 with him, he's totally refreshing, interesting, informed, well-bred, and in the main, well-mannered, but a tough son of a bitch.
Great.
Wow, that's great.
Excellent.
I have a photo I want you to look at.
Say if Black hadn't got running back, Black hadn't got hurt, we'd have beat Michigan. That damn Greasy, he was crowing around over his kid. But if they don't lose that, Cougars don't lose that running back, then and we wouldn't have put ourselves at the mercy of Ryan Leaf in the last second or Mike Price. Jesus, that wasn't smart. I mean, what?
Well, I'm glad to see it hurts anyway.
No, I just hated to see it because I
Thank
know.
God, we got Keith Jackson doing our broadcast.
I,
It's going to be great.
I know how much it means to
Sure you do.
to a community or to a college like that. That the Wolverines can shrug it off and going down the road. You know,
Yeah.
they've had a great history. But you're going to tell me that the success Don James had here and Jim Owens had, Jim Owens really had a bigger impact, I suspect, than James.